to chairs and to boards. And then the third area I'm interested in is what they're learning about themselves in the role. My underlying assumption about leadership is that the practice and how we understand leadership is constantly evolving. And given the unprecedented levels of change and complexity and challenge in the last 9 months, I'm curious about how the practice and understanding of leadership, particularly the role of the chair of the board, is evolving. Today, I'm joined by Nessan Vaughan, and Nessan has a lot of current experience of being the chair of a number of different organizations. Welcome, Nessan, and thank you very much for joining me today.
Thanks very much, Kieran. I'm delighted to be here.
Good. So we might begin so introduce yourself, Nessan. Tell us a little bit about yourself, maybe a little bit about your background, yes, and then the organizations that you're currently involved in as chair.
I will. Thanks, Kieran. Yeah. Well, I worked all my career in the public service, in the National Manpower Service, Department of Labour, and FÁS, and the latter being for the most part of my career. I worked in operations, I worked in management, I worked in policy development at a national level for the last 6 years in FÁS. But I had been doing a little bit of volunteering, and I decided at the ripe old age of 50, nearly 51, that I wanted to do something else and that I could retire at 50 from the public service. So I decided to take a leap, if you like, in the dark, on what they call an actuarially reduced pension, and to go full-time as a volunteer. So I put the word out there, I'm available, can I help? What are the opportunities that might be there where I can bring some of my experience to bear fruit? My main motivation, Kieran, was working in the area of addressing social exclusion and inequality.
Okay. So say a little bit about then the current roles that you have as chair.
Yes. So I'm chair of 5 organizations. I know that sounds a fair bit, but it's my full-time role doing this sort of work. Okay. And I do other work in addition to that, hands-on as well, and with other boards in an advisory capacity. But most of them happen by chance. I'm chair currently of Northside Partnership, a local development company in the North Side. Youre Youth and Community Services, a community development organisation in the Northeast Inner City. The New Life Centre, it's a small, like a pastoral organisation almost, in Darndale. North Dublin MABS, Money Advice and Budgeting Service, which is one of these new merged companies, regional companies, and an the Employment Network 10, which is really a managing agent for people on the Job Initiative programme in the inner city.
So you have an absolute wealth of experience of chairing generally, but then specifically over the last 9 months since March, the middle of March, when the country locked down for the first lockdown. And I think what's going to be interesting is you'll have seen the experience through the 5 different chairing roles that you have. So as you reflect back now on the 9 months, give me a sense of what's the experience being like of being the chair of organizations.
Yeah, to say it's challenging, it's been challenging, I suppose, Kieran, is an understatement. Initially, I think I might have been saying to you beforehand, you nearly felt in the way because the imperative was to follow these urgent public guidelines that were coming from government to get people off-site, home, safely home. And a lot of the organisation I'm working with, like everywhere else, I suppose, looking at what are the guidelines, who's to stay in, who's to go home, what does that mean for the service? Can we keep the service going? Do we pay our staff? Will we continue to get funding? A whole raft of immediate questions that were there, and I didn't want to be intruding on that urgency that the CEOs and the senior managers were addressing. At the same time, I wanted to see how could I help, and I was also conscious that I have a responsibility for ensuring that us as an organisation were following the public guidelines, but that if I can help the managers and CEOs in a supportive way in doing that. So I try to keep myself informed as to what is the advice out there. And chat it over, maybe be just another support or a sounding board to the CEOs, etc.
Okay. And how long did that period last for then? So that's the kind of there's almost like an adjustment to what's
Yeah,
going on. How do we incorporate all the advice? What do we do?
I'd say,
How long did that phase last for?
yeah,
And
I'd say,
then what was next?
yeah, I'd say it was a few weeks, Kieran. It's
Yeah,
hard to put an exact time because, you know, um, guidelines and guidance was evolving. They were evolving, and then we were saying, what category are we in? Are we essential? Are we not essential? If you remember that back, what's the
yeah,
essential service? What isn't? Do we go 100% vacate our premises and see, can we work from home? In many cases, it's not possible to work from home.
yeah,
As I say, will we have funding? What do we say, tell our employees
yeah,
about
yeah,
their own personal safety, about their wages, their livelihood? So that took a few weeks, I suppose, to get a handle on that. And
okay,
I would hope that I adjusted to being more a supportive role to the CEOs at that point. But I was really working hard myself to familiarize myself with what was what were the
okay,
guidelines and
okay,
good
okay.
practices. And I was linking with other organizations, public sector as well, where I had contacts to see how are you handling it? Do we have protocols? Do we have a map even to safely move from one phase into another?
Okay, okay. So there was almost two parts that I'm hearing. One was informing yourself about what was
Mm,
happening and how because the situation was unfolding, and
mm.
then being supportive. So how did you express that support to the organization?
Yeah, I mean, the contacts for the first few weeks were all by phone call, as you can imagine, all
Okay.
by phone call. That's first of all, that was the mode of communication. If I got something written, and I was getting other documents that other organisations were well positioned, well resourced, maybe good big HR departments, etc. So I could
Yeah,
share some of the information. I said, maybe look at that. How
yeah,
would that
yeah,
fit? Are you comfortable with that? Have you enough information? Because some are better resourced than others. Of those organizations I named, even those organizations I chair, some are bigger than others, have more resources, access to greater support, while others are very reliant. So we were sharing information and support as well,
okay, okay,
and with permission of the various organizations. And it was a great so there was a great sense of collegiality at that time. Organizations said, no problem. Yes, share our guidelines, share what our HR department, by all means, in our sector.
okay,
There was
okay,
great solidarity in the sector.
okay. And so the contact presumably then was principally with the CEO of the
Mm,
organization, was it?
it
So I'm
was.
imagining
It
lots of
was.
conversations, trying to see. So were you playing a yeah? So what kind of role did you see yourself as playing with the CEO? So you were bringing information, that's one piece, and connecting with maybe other organizations. And
Yeah.
what else? How would you describe the role you were playing
I
with the
suppose,
CEOs?
I suppose we wanted to, first of all, ensure the safety of all our staff, that people
Yeah,
weren't coming unnecessarily. As you remember, like the pandemic at that stage was, I suppose, unknown.
yeah,
And you might say, I don't know whether it's an exaggeration, say rampant, but certainly was spreading rapidly. And there's a lot of
yeah,
fear
yeah,
about
yeah.
people's safety. So maybe the first priority, I think, was ensure the safety and well-being of our staff.
Okay,
Secondly, to
okay,
secure the funding for the organisation to ensure we're compliant with whatever the instructions or guidelines were, that we were compliant, so that we enable us to continue to receive our funding.
yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and I think they were the main areas. We didn't formal meetings, Kieran, were gone out the board. So board
Yeah.
meetings, had to forget those at that stage. We
Okay.
hadn't heard of I hadn't heard of Zoom anyway. I don't know whether many other people had. So we were
Okay.
saying, oh, we have to cancel that meeting. We can't have that. Yeah, no, that can't go ahead. Are we off site? Uh, then began to look at what supports can we put in place for our workers at home, those who are
Yeah.
working at
Okay.
home. So
Okay.
that was the next phase, if you like.
Okay. And when did the boards begin to re-emerge via Zoom or whatever virtual tech?
Yeah,
When did they begin to re-emerge?
yeah. It's an interesting question because can I say, even before answering that, Kieran, I did hear some boards having these meetings by Zoom, and I was a bit scared of it. But being honest, how would I conduct a board meeting via Zoom? What the hell would that would look like?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
How would that work for me? So I felt, I was taken out of my comfort zone.
Okay.
I'm
Okay.
very used to, chair in a room, you prepare well for meetings, and you have a degree of at least of a sense of being in control, let's say. So
Okay.
we're all a
Okay.
bit ruffled when when we're taken
Okay.
out of that. So I felt a
Yeah.
little bit, oh my God, how did that work? And so I was looking around to see, how did it go? How did it work? What did you do? What's the technology? What are the protocols for Zoom? So I'd say, so time-wise, I'd say there was at least 1 month, maybe more, before there were any formal meetings.
Yeah.
What I seem to recall is meetings cancelled.
Okay. Yeah.
But then I began to think, well, we have to have meetings. We have to have decisions. We still, the services were still, what was remarkable was then, we were still, in many cases, keeping the services going. This was, I know maybe we'll come to this shortly, but this was very interesting, that you could deliver services in different ways.
Okay. So I'm getting a sense that there was a really strong operational focus in the first couple of weeks, just trying to figure out what to do, how to keep the services going, how to protect staff, and then cancelling board meetings. And then at some stage then I'm getting a sense then, okay, so you said their board had to be reconvened because there was decisions to be made, and part of the challenge of that was the technology. So what were the kinds of discussions that then began to take place at board meetings? And I'm wondering if they were different than usual, because presumably the board had to then try and figure out how do we respond. So maybe say a little bit about what began to happen at board meetings when they eventually began to reconvene.
Yeah, well, I think what we discussed initially was there was a good focus, I suppose, on COVID protocols, procedures, guidelines. Are we compliant? Okay. I think that was the concern of boards. In terms of the conduct of the meetings, I had to say it did go quite smoothly, to my surprise. People were becoming very experienced in using Zoom or Teams or whatever they were using, and often through their own personal life. Families, began to use Zoom. So we said, oh yeah, I've used that before. So the technology didn't become such a big issue in the end, but the focus of a lot of meetings earlier on that I recall would be about, have we got a roadmap, a map to exit? And then as things were unwinding, and there was some emphasis then later on about getting back, you were doing the reverse, how to return to work safely.
Okay.
So we began to look at there were lots of guidelines out there. The health HSE, another health and HSA, Health and Safety Authority rather, producing very good guidelines and protocols. So we began to look at those, how to return safely, and meanwhile keep the services on the road. So we began to meet more regularly, and the agenda began to become more conventional, let's say. The services, the budgets, the programs, what the funders are saying, how are our targets, what else are we doing, how are we responding? So in many cases, what was remarkable was the agility of a number of those organizations I mentioned, and I know in the sector, of responding to the needs. And we were, in fairness, given a degree of flexibility by our funders to maybe use some unspent money for different programs to respond to, for example, you might have heard of community call, delivering food and supports to people who are isolated, and we're all allowed to get involved in that because we're saying this is a crisis. This is an unprecedented crisis, and it was remarkable how organisations, including those I'm involved with, responded.
Okay, and were there things that you discovered about the organisations you're chairing that were a surprise to you, let's say, or some?
I think people are adaptable, I surprised how well, in the main, people adapted to the new, how responsible people were. There's a sense of the collective, of solidarity. We have to do what's in all our interests, keep ourselves safe, but respond to those who are most marginalised. How can we reach out to those people? And people got a great deal of satisfaction in that. However, that said, there were some people, some of the workers, maybe they found it difficult to work at home because of the home environment, the home space, prefer to work in their office as usual. There are others who are very happy to work at home, and that remains the case because maybe of their family circumstances, the stage of life, their children, their age of children. So that whole mix of personal circumstances varied hugely. But I think I think and the main surprise really was, I think the agility of people and flexibility and resilience. Perhaps resilience is a good word. That people are resilient. Now,
Okay.
we can't take that for granted, though. However, I tell you what came up on board a fair bit, Kieran, as well. When I go into that, not to assume anything too much, that people, those who are not to, and I remember someone saying at a board meeting, don't assume people are coping. If we're honest, I remember someone saying at a board meeting, if we're honest, we're all finding this difficult. I
Okay.
remember the
Okay.
director saying that, and I thought that was a very good thing to say. That gave us all permission to say, yeah, I'm finding it bloody hard myself.
Okay.
And not to
Okay.
have had this facade of I'm in control, I'm in charge, I'm doing very well. It's okay, like I'm struggling, I'm finding this difficult. So let's see. So an emphasis began to evolve on well-being of staff. What are we doing? Are we checking in on those who are not in the office? What way do we do that? Tell us how you're doing that. What are staff saying?
Okay. Okay.
And that became across the board, almost, I would say, a concern.
I'm interested then when you said there about a director saying, let's not assume that everybody's okay because we're all finding this difficult. Were there different types of conversations around the board, or did board members show up in maybe a different way than usual? Because often well, because everybody was finding it so difficult and so challenged by it, and it was impacting in multiple levels, I'm wondering, how did that show up or manifest itself at actual board meetings? The board members' own personal experience
Yeah.
of the pandemic.
Yeah, well, it didn't give rise to any lengthy discussion, but one could sense by even body language, even by Zoom, that was through the nods,
Okay.
that,
Okay.
yeah, this is difficult. Didn't
Yeah.
expand, or maybe didn't want to go there too
Yeah. Yeah.
much either. But one sensed that, yeah,
Okay.
that's a really good point. You can relate it to yourself, how you're feeling.
Yeah. So there
And
was
they're all doing it you could see them all on Zoom from home and various parts themselves. And you could see it was almost visible that people were struggling a little bit.
Yeah. And so they had a kind of a lived experience of what the staff were going through, because sometimes board members might be
Yeah,
on a board because of their technical
yeah,
expertise, but they mightn't have a current experience of the issues that the organization is responding to.
yeah.
Whereas in this instance, the board members had a shared experience with what staff were experiencing, allowing for individual circumstances. People will always experience something differently, but there was some kind of shared experience there as well.
There was, and I have to say, across the organisations I'm involved with, what has been impressive too is the concern, the genuine concern that the directors, irrespective of their background, private sector, public sector, community sector, professional people, not professional people, whatever level they operate at, their genuine concern for the well-being of the staff.
Okay.
Very striking, very striking.
And was that different in the last 9 months, or?
It was higher on the agenda, yeah. There was more of a focus on it, yeah, more of a focus.
Okay.
And even
Okay.
checking, what are you doing? And in some cases, bring the HR manager in, tell us what you're doing. We'd like to hear it. What is the plan?
Okay.
And tell us what the staff are saying. And in some cases, in fairness, I can think of another organisation I'm involved with where the CEO was saying, we need to support our staff more. We need to have access to maybe EAP, if EAP wasn't, an employee assistance program that wasn't there. We need a bit of more professional support for the staff, particularly for smaller organisations that didn't have, maybe like a HR department would have that, could put that in place quite easily. So it was a bit of buying in some supports, as well as a relation to just the health and safety aspects of working safely too, because particularly when we were returning to work safely, and I think that's what it was called, a plan to return to work safely. In some cases, we had to get in a bit of expertise because of the size of the organization, mightn't have had the in-house resources to do that. So we had to say, can we buy it in? Had to persuade the board to support it, persuade the board that we had the money to do it, and that it needed to be bought in to give confidence to the staff. I remember having that particular conversation with a board. Look, this is important. We need to do that. We have to buy it in. Staff need this confidence that it's safe for them, and it's some, maybe professionals are saying this is what you should do when you come in. This is a plan, and very well received when we did it, I must say.
Okay. So a real shift in focus, or much more awareness around the well-being of staff and the importance of attending to that. What would you say the value that the boards that you're a part of brought in the midst of the pandemic? So what was the added value that they brought?
Yeah, they have very broad perspectives. They all work somewhere, so very few of them are retired people, and that is not to suggest in any way the retired person doesn't have a vast wealth of experience. Of course they do, but many of them are dealing with some of those issues in their own workplace, and they were getting those guidelines and those supports, which act as a sort of a prompt to them to bring to the table. Our company is doing this. This is what we've done. This is how maybe it might be done. So it was really good to that contribution informed by their own workplaces, and it didn't matter what their background was. To be honest, HR, finance, legal, technical,
So it strikes me that particularly as people were rapidly trying to figure things out, if you have access to multiple sources of information and expertise around the board, that's a real benefit to tease out the data. Any other value that you saw the boards bringing in the last 9 months?
Yeah, well, I probably there was more of an emphasis on the softer side of things, like that, your well-being, your support. Even they'd also say, check on your CEO. Also concern about working from home and when to switch off. And
so the board members were raising this as these as issues in a way that maybe before a year ago that's softer stuff. So bringing attention to those softer pieces.
Bringing attention to those, absolutely. And the whole, I suppose, lack of I suppose a framework for working from home too, with some issues. There was at times they'd see reports and saying, I'm producing this on Sunday night, or I'm working, the staff are working way beyond the normal hours. And someone said, well, hold on now, are we happy with that? What controls have we got? What monitoring are we doing in the staff that we know they're not, that they are switching off? Have we got proper protocols in place around this? So it was interesting that some of that discussion. It didn't dominate it, Kieran. I don't want to overlap it. It didn't dominate it. Of course, we were simultaneously, and as we moved through the pandemic and the yo-yo, the up and down, the easing restrictions, the imposition of restrictions, or reimposition of restrictions, we were still dealing with increasingly the bread and butter, the core, the programs, the budgets. Are we on target? Are we not? The plan. And, how are we doing overall there? And it's interesting because while we were in many cases able to provide the bulk of the services in a different way, however, there were some people you couldn't get the services to, and that's I might like to come back to that at some point about those who can be left behind and the exacerbation of inequality arising from COVID.
And the organisations weren't in a position to access them for whatever reason.
Well, it might be some of the people we deal with are people who are more, let's say, removed, distant from the labour market, have a lot of challenges in their lives, are more impoverished, digital poverty included. So how can they, if they liked face-to-face engagement and they can't have that, how are we doing that? How are we doing that? And are we leaving them behind? Or what way can we do something to our services to even reach out to them in different ways? So really challenges to our services, but lots of learning that we can retain even if we hopefully move out of the current restrictions.
You mentioned there that one of your board members gave you a prompt, about the importance of checking in with the CEO. The CEO chair relationship is absolutely critical in terms of an organization's success. What kind of role did you find yourself playing with the different CEOs? So you mentioned in the beginning, the first couple of weeks, there was an issue for you. You didn't want to be getting in the way because there was
Yeah,
such a focus on kind of rapidly responding and trying to figure out how do we close the offices, get people working from home, how do we continue? So there was lots of frantic activity almost
yeah.
in the first couple of weeks. So say a little bit more about what role you found yourself playing with the different CEOs.
Yeah, yeah, and some more than those. Just to say, even the 5 organisations I mentioned there at the beginning of our discussion, they vary in scale, they vary in levels of responsibility, the levels of complexity, levels of supports that are there. So some need more support. It's like managing, if you like, staff. Some need more supports than others. Some are very self-sufficient. You become involved. You're there when you need to become involved. They know, it's letting them know you are there for them.
Okay.
But I would always, that would be my style anyway. I'm there when you need me as well. So don't ever hesitate to contact me. I'm there.
Okay.
But then also during the pandemic to be a bit more proactive about how is it going? You know, how do you need? You know, do we need to talk about this?
So did you find yourself that reaching out and in ways, whereas maybe a year ago, because things were much more stable, that there wasn't the requirement for you to be proactive in reaching out? Is that
not as proactive? You know, you would have set times where you would meet. You would meet the CEO. By the way, CEO is a generic term we're using here. They're not all called CEOs. They're managers and whatever the different titles. You know, depending. But I'll use the CEO generically, if you like. Some, you know, you would have fixed points where you'd meet them, come up to a board. You'd always meet before a board, make sure there's proper preparation for a board meeting. But there was a bit more, proactive reaching out. And those you felt, well, maybe some would struggle more than others, mightn't have the access to some of the information, what to do next in a way. So you'd just be there to guide them a little bit more, you know. But can I say, at the same time, Kieran, this is an interesting thing in the sector, and this might be going off a little bit of the point for you, but just to mention this as well, the reality that we were dealing with. Side by side with the pandemic, side by side with moving people off site and trying to deliver services in an alternative way, and then later on bring them back in site and then moving them off again, is we had this charities code of governance we're trying to journey through this year.
So just say a little bit about what challenges that presented.
This year, well, I'm sure you're aware, but for all charities, there's a charities code of governance, and we're expected to comply with that. Well, it's comply and explain, but largely comply by the end of this year. And then we report next year to the charities regulation when we produce our annual report on the level of compliance with the code. So there's quite a bit of work of information, policies, procedures to be documented. It's often the documenting and providing the evidence that one is compliant. For some, they could do it reasonably well, without an enormous effort, because a lot of them would be in place. But for small organizations, it's a bigger challenge. So trying to sort of maybe engage in some case your CEO who's worrying about the safety of their staff and well-being, and say, now, by the way, how are we doing on the governance code? You know, so you felt like
you might get a different reaction. But what it illustrates is that in the midst of the pandemic, there was a whole lot of ordinary stuff that needed to continue, that couldn't be addressed, and that produces, you have to prioritize where you put your attention. And maybe some choices that need to be made, but at the same time, those kind of regulatory requirements were still had to be met.
And that's a particular challenge this year for us. So I, by the way, welcome the code. So I'd be pushing it anyway. But I realised at certain times it wasn't opportune to be pushing it. So you had to balance that and pick your moments. But
so is that part of the skill of being chair? You gotta. You got to pick your moment, and you got to balance stuff. Is that?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. I mean, I see the role as supporting the executive and delivering the service, protecting the organisation in many ways. To see you're compliant, you've good governance, you've good overall oversight of what's happening, you've good accountability, you've robust systems, HR, finance, health and safety, risk, etc. You have proper meetings, properly conducted board meetings to protect the organisation, to keep the funding going, to give confidence to the funders that we're a properly run organisation, and therefore free up the frontline people to do the very worthwhile job they're doing.
Okay.
Sometimes the frontline people don't know about even that, what you're doing behind the scenes. Maybe they don't necessarily have to know too much about it, but the CEO certainly, the most senior member staff needs to know. This protects the organization. We're not just there to torture people with paperwork. This protects the organization, gives confidence to funders that you're a well-run organization. So it's that balance, you know, seeing that the services are running properly, but that the governance and the regulatory requirements are being met and maybe exceeded. Aim for more, not just compliance.
And you mentioned there about trying to balance things. So like in a perfect world, we'd have enough time and enough resources to do everything that needed to be done in the time that it needed to be done. But of course we don't. And it's particularly that's been the case in the last 9 months. Yeah. What are some of the choices or tension points that you've had to, you know, pick your moment or carefully navigate over the last 9 months?
Yeah, well, there may have been things in maybe the work plan or the strategic plan, if there was one, that you're due to do or implement this year. So some cases I'd say, just forget that. Yeah, that's overtaken by something else. This is a pandemic. This is unprecedented. And plans, anyway. I always say plans. We're not there to serve the plan. The plan is there to serve us. So if a plan's no longer relevant or appropriate or needs to be tweaked or adjusted, you change the plan. You don't have to just follow a plan for the sake of planning. So this, who when they were doing their risk analysis, Kieran, I often ask myself, who actually put in a pandemic?
I've yet to meet any organization that said, yeah, we had a worldwide pandemic in our risk register.
Yeah, and isn't there a lesson there too? This often you tick boxes, you have all these things in place, you look right, but here's something coming down. Here's the real world. Something comes down, and you're not ready for it.
So what's the lesson, Nessan?
I think you have to be flexible and agile, and be able to respond, to be realistic about what you're capable of achieving and delivering, and be prepared to drop certain things. Once it doesn't alienate your funder, you always have to keep an eye on the funder. But my view there is you keep them informed. Okay. There aren't surprises for them. And in fairness to them, I have to say this, because often there's necessary tension between our sector, the community involved sector, and the state. I think that's often a good tension. It's necessary. Sometimes I don't think we'd be doing our job if we weren't challenging the state. But in fairness, during this pandemic, I think they've been really understanding of what's happened. They've been very responsive. You talk to them, look, okay, we understand this is very unusual. Get your staff home. Those targets, we realize they cannot be met this year. But we explain that. We don't cause any surprises for them. And that, so there was a sense that we were working with our funders very closely, and it was good, but not to hide it. If you have a difficult, I think it's true. That's the true life anyway. No, it's true when when you do a performance review with your staff, or you do it with your chair even. I had a boss who say, there should be no surprise. When I was being appraised, if you like, he used to say to me, I used to have a three times a year meeting. He said, there should be no surprises here. Because if I'm unhappy with your performance, or I should know about you should know about it before we sit down today. And if you're struggling with something, I should know about this before today. So ongoing communication is hugely important with all your stakeholders. Yeah.
So just to go back a little bit, you're saying that the importance, part of the lesson this year is about the importance of being agile and being flexible. Is that so? What learning are you accumulating this year? So, for example, if I was interviewing you a year ago about the role of chair and boards and their role, and I said, how would it be different how is it different now in the light of the experience? So, what's the wisdom from this experience that you're taking forward, and that you might have given to yourself 9 months ago, if you could, and if you had access to a time machine and said, what would be what's the wisdom?
Well, I think looking at alternative ways of doing things, this is sort of like lateral thinking in a way, but thinking outside the box in many ways. You often construct yourself, you have to deliver it this way, but there are often other ways of reaching the same result. So to be more open, have an open mindset, and let a bit of creativity flow. Be aware. You have to be aware that some people are more creative than others. Give space to creativity, And not be just, you know, it's not just ticking boxes we're at.
Okay.
There are different ways, creative ways of doing things, and let the creative people blossom a little bit. You know, I often think of the bonos, you know, the 6 thinking hats and all that.
Yeah.
Looking at the facts and and then gathering different ways of achieving things. You always have the facts. You always gather the facts, but how you reach that end, there may be other ways of reaching it.
Okay. And what is it about the experience of the last 9 months that's taught you about the value of that, giving the creative people their head?
Yeah, working in teams, I think,
Okay.
is hugely important. Yeah, not silos. You know, so even within the staff, you know, of these organisations, I've seen them coming together now more creatively. That's it. That's my area. You know, I'm responsible for that program. Fine, you still are responsible for that program, but taking an organisation-wide perspective.
Okay.
And people move. You know, like people working together. Collaborative work is incredible.
And have you seen more of that collaborative work in the last 9 months than you would have in the last 18?
I have people working. I have, yeah, coming up with ideas and plans and suggestions, proposals, yeah, of other ways of doing things, other ways of delivering things. Yes, I have. Not just people looking at their own, you know, narrow, if you like, area of responsibility, or very specific area of responsibility, but looking beyond that, looking beyond for the organisation or the company. Yeah, okay. And I know it's more difficult doing it when you're not sitting down, you know, together and so forth. But you know, it can be done. So more collaborative working.
So there's 2 pieces of wisdom that you're taking forward. One is around, you know, being more creative and looking at alternative ways of doing things, and then collaborative working. Any other pieces of wisdom that you're taking forward from the experience?
Yeah, well, I just think I think it's just having to respond very quickly to emerging crises. You know, like who would have thought who would have thought? I mean, even just as a case study, who would have thought you could go home, work from home, and still produce maybe 80-90% of what you're supposed to be doing? Who would have thought that? And trusting staff, trust. Who would have thought? You know, the old way of management and managing staff. How do we know they're working and they're at home, and who's monitoring them and accountable and clocking in and clocking out and coming in at 9 and going home at 5? You know, we get awfully rigid. You know, people. So I think managing people has to change as well. Trusting people more, giving people more freedom to do. Okay, we all have a piece of work. I don't mean we're still accountable, but does it matter if it's 9 to 5? Really, does it matter?
Yeah. I love what you say there. Who would have thought? Who would have thought that you could move entire workforces over a weekend or a couple of days from a? Who would have thought? There's something about that there's stuff that there's untapped potential in our midst that we don't see, but we've spotted it now because of the experience of the last 9 months.
Yeah, and even and using Zoom, and I mean, I'm not a big fan. I prefer to meet in person. Much prefer to meet in person and look at body language and all the other human interactions that most of us like anyway. But it has facilitated attendance. I've noticed that in meetings and seminars, an increase in attendance, which, you know, very interesting.
Yeah.
So I think we'll have a blended way of working as well and meeting in the future. I don't see this day stopping completely. I mean, I'm thinking of a national committee I was on, not one of those boards, but a national committee. We all met on Saturday, people coming from Derry, Donegal, Cork, and Kerry, etc. And you know, for them, it's a day gone anyway.
Yeah.
But I noticed since we have had a few of those meetings, since almost 100% attendance.
So it facilitates access. You mentioned earlier on that you had to kind of move out of your own comfort zone and in terms of learning how to use Zoom.
Yeah.
Any other comfort zones you had to push through in the last 9 months in your role as chair?
Yeah, I think. Well, I think that, you know, I suppose there were more deadlines imposed as well as chair things you had to do. You know, like, you know, I had to, for example, like you had to ensure, well, okay, the CEO was doing it, but I was still ultimately responsible. We are all at home and we are all complying with the public health guidelines. We're doing that. And then if we're returning safely, we are returning safely. Am I satisfied that we all are?
Okay.
We all have returned safely, that we have appropriate structures, advice, protocols, etc. in place. Now, I'm not going around inspecting them, but I need to be satisfied that they're there. So I'd be looking for reassurance from the CEO. Have you got that plan in place? Can I have it? Can you bring it to the board? Let us see it, that we are compliant from a safety point of view as well. So,
did you experience your role as chair as maybe more onerous, more responsible than maybe a year ago?
Yeah, because I think so. And I suppose I was having to respond to a pandemic too. Yeah, chair. Yeah, it was more onerous in that sense and more uncertain. How could we meet? How often could we meet? How effective would our meetings be? How can we communicate with each other? How can I get, proper participation? And I tell you what came in very useful, Kieran, as well. And maybe this applies generally, not just in the context of a pandemic, but particularly in a pandemic. I noticed the work of committees, board committees.
Okay. Say a bit more about that.
Yeah, if you have a HR committee, a finance committee, a governance committee, they do a lot of the, the practical, the real oversight on behalf of the board and present to the board to give reassurance to the board. Look, we've looked at this procedure, we've looked at this policy, we've looked at, let's say, return to work safety policy. Yeah, it's gone through the appropriate committee. We've examined it. We're very happy with it because it would get more maybe detailed scrutiny prior to the board, and it gives board assurance. Or we're recommending this to the board. We've examined it. We're happy. Similarly, even the journey on the towards compliance with the governance code. When I have committees, depending on the size of the organisation, or do a lot of that work through those committees, and it gives confidence to the board has had adequate examination and scrutiny. So I think committees.
And did they play a particular role then over the last 9 months, given all the uncertainty and all the decision making that had to be done?
They did in some, not in all cases, but in some cases, the bigger ones. Yeah, they did. Yeah. And it's a real lesson, I think, for me, for a board. Because look, a board, when you think, how often does a board meet? Even the best board, how long can you meet? What's an effective, on Zoom anyway, what's an effective meeting? You can't have 8-hour meetings, so forth, but particularly with lots of documentation and paperwork to examine. So, and I as chair, I think it's important that there's proper oversight, real oversight of an organisation and accountability. And that when something's come to the board, it's gone to maybe where it can, gone through some other layer of examination that examines it in more detail. And it's led by directors too, that the committee should be chaired by a director of the board. So it's that link to the board.
So you were saying there, that's a lesson for you, the value of the committee and the way the committee can support the work. Any other lessons that you're taking away from this experience of the last 9 months?
Yeah, well, I think it's also being always, clear your responsibility as chair and the CEO is that division of responsibility, to be very clear on it. I like to think I am clear on it, but you don't be treading too much into, it's not my role to go around the offices and inspect them to see are they okay and they're compliant and have they got the perspex up and so forth. But my job is to be satisfied that they are there. But just that being clear on the division of responsibilities. But I suppose if anything is re-emphasized, and you mentioned it there, the importance of the relationship between chair and CEO or the most senior manager. And doesn't mean we'll be the best of mates, of course, worked well together, but I suppose that the critical friend type relationship that you should have, I think.
So the chair is the critical friend.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So what does the critical friend bring that's of value?
Yeah, well, I think you bring you stand back a little bit and you bring hopefully a broader perspective. The CEO is involved in the delivery, the day-to-day requirements. Now, of course, a good CEO thinks strategically, and they do, but their concern is getting the business done, getting done right, meeting the targets, seeing the staff are okay. But I think a chair, and I like to see is take a broad perspective and look at what's happening in the sector more broadly. Okay. Maybe bring to it other perspectives, and so I think it's very important that chair keeps himself or herself informed of developments in the sector. So, chair is about governance. You have to be clear. When people join the board, they say, I'm very interested in the work you do and the service you provide. And let's say I chaired a youth service before, a wonderful youth service, and people sometimes will come, I'm very interested in youth work and I love what they're doing. I said, but you're not joining, you won't be doing that on the board.
Yeah. So there's something about being really clear about what the role and
clear,
focus of the board is around governance.
Be very clear on your role and responsibility, supporting the delivery of that service.
So we're coming towards the end of the interview, Nessan. So my final question is, in 5 years' time, when you look back at 2020, what would you like to be able to say about the leadership that you brought in your role as chair?
Yeah, I would hope I played some role in supporting the executive in navigating through safely through the pandemic, in being a support to them personally at a very difficult and challenging time, to be able to, that I've been able to maybe respond myself, challenge myself to be a bit more responsive and to learn. I have to learn, to be open to learning yourself in your role as chair, in your relationship with the CEO, in broader developments in the world of work, how work can be done, not just to think along traditional ways of doing things.
Okay. Nessan, thank you very much. I really appreciate you joining me for this conversation and for being so open and honest and reflective about your experience over the last 9 months. And I wish you every continued success in your role as chair into 2021.
Thank you very much, Karen. I enjoyed the challenges you gave me there too. Thank you.
Thank you very much.